Following on from the video I did about setting up my strats, let's talk about setting up Floyd Rose guitar. So I've got two at the moment. I've got the Charvel and I've got my red Charvel, but they're slightly two different setups. This has got it floating, the other one's decked. Some tips for setting these Floyds up. They're notoriously like Marmite. People love them or hate them. And it's just because they require just a little bit more balancing really to get set up. Plus you've got a little bit more going on here than you have in your standard Strat bridge or even just like a Les Paul or something. I'll talk about if I was restringing this, the sort of steps I would go through. So the first thing, string at a time or all 6 strings at once. It depends. If this was a rosewood fingerboard guitar and I hadn't oiled the wood for a while, then I'd probably take all the strings off and then oil the neck, so you're keeping up maintenance. If I was restringing this at the moment, both approaches, you want to be really trying to keep, particularly if you've got a Floyd that's floating, you know, got it set up floating here. You want to be keeping this in the state that it is with your string gauge. So what you can do, you can take a cloth and stick it under here. So you're trying to keep the trem at the same sort of position it is horizontally. So when you release the tension from the strings, the trem isn't going to get pulled all the way back from the spring tension here. So when then you come to string up and get tuned up, your deviation from what it was at, zeroed, isn't too far. So that's the first thing you would do, is you basically want to get that stable before you take the strings off. Regarding the strings, as you probably see in here, I put the ball ends up here. Yeah. And that's from years and years ago when I was playing and I had a Floyd guitar like my Gems. If I broke a string, I could very easily just take a wind off here, stretch it out, lock it here again, and I'd be able to go again without having to replace the whole string. I personally like to keep the ball end that end, and I give it a couple of winds round. I don't know if the camera's going to pick that up, but a couple of winds round. So I've got a little bit there just in case, you know, you never know. Just with the Strat and stuff, when I string up, if it's a string at a time and all 6 strings, I'll get them, obviously these string locks are off when I'm doing this, of course, I've not got them on. I'll get up to tune and I'll stretch the strings, yeah, just like I do on the Strat. I'll go along the strings and pull up to get the stretch along the whole length of the kind of string. So I would tune up and then basically lock a pair at a time and then tune up again. The other thing to watch out for, see your fine tuners, make sure they're all in a mid position. Because what you might find over time is when you're tuning and using the fine tuners, once you're locked, they get closer and closer in, depending on your guitar. So if then you come to string again, you haven't got much range of your fine tuners here. So I tend to kind of loosen them off and get them in a midpoint, so I could go low or I could tune up again. Yeah. But I pretty much do a pair of strings at a time. So I would lock the E and A strings. Now, one thing to watch out for is when you lock it, the pressure of the string lock pushing the strings might push these sharp. Yeah, so sometimes you can tune just a little hair flat before you tighten that up. But I would tighten that down, then I'd retune all the 6 strings again. Yeah. Then I would do the D and G strings and then retune all the 6 strings again. Of course, the minute you lock, you're using fine tuners for these until you get to the top 2 strings. Then you might have a little bit of fine tune. But the thing about it, of course, is once you've put in all that work, that's kind of it. Assuming your locking system's nice, made, there's no movement in your bridge or anything, or your nut, you're going to pretty much be in tune until you restring again. So that's the benefit of putting in all the work. Actually setting up a Floyd, so if you were changing string gauge, or you know the guitar's moved a little bit, or you're literally setting up a guitar for your own personal playing, again, action wise, I'm pretty similar to what I was doing in the Strat. You know, aim for 2mm here, whatever. Obviously you can't really adjust the height of the saddles in the Floyd. They're stepped depending on, you know, where they are in the position. The lower here, then they go slightly higher and then slightly higher in the middle. So it kind of matches the radius of a pretty typical rocking guitar. You can only really set your bridge height with your Floyds, yeah. So that's the only thing, you haven't got that control of the individual string heights, but you can get a good approximation with lowering and raising the treble and bass end of the bridge there. But a big part of a floating Floyd setup is all about the spring tension and the string tension. So what you're really aiming for, if you think about what's going on here with a Floyd, you've got your 2 pivot points, your knife edges, and they're going in to the post like that. So when you're using the Floyd, you want it to be in this nice zero position. Now, typically, it used to be in the old Ibanez guitars, you could see the hardened steel edge of the knife point on the side of the trem. And what you would try and do is get that parallel with the top of the guitar. So you knew it was, and 180 degrees going straight into that pivot point. With this typical Floyd setup, you've got your base plate, and I try and set it up so I've got the base plate flat. So you're not, when you're using the trem, it's not returning to here and it's got a little bit of wiggle room, so you'll lose tuning stability, or it's a little bit pulled back with the string tension and you're a little bit like that. So I tried to aim for setting up that spring and string tension to get that nice and flat. The only way to do that, of course, is to just micro adjust here. So you're talking, if you've got your Phillips screw head there, you got your cross, you're just moving it 90 degrees a turn, like a little quarter turn every time, just to adjust one in this, and then you would, if it went sharp, you'd flatten it off. So you're trying to get that perfect balance to have that flat, and then you're hitting the knife edge. Now that's of course in a floating setup like that I have here. My red Charvel, this is a slightly different setup, just a bit more traditional. When the Floyds come out, just stick them on a body. I've got this one stopped here, so it cannot be up-pulled because I've got the D-tune and stuff in this. So the spring tension in this is slightly higher to pull the trem flat against the kind of, you could either have it like the top of your guitar body or against this stop that I've got here. Now the thing is, if you put too much spring tension in, when you try and do a dive bomb, you're going to be fighting those springs. So your trem will feel really, really stiff. So it's trying to find that magic point where you've got enough spring tension to pull that back to keep it, so when you're adjusting, like going to drop D or whatever, it's not going to move forward. So that's the only difference with something that's decked or doesn't have any up pull versus the the floating Floyd. Oh, one little tip, I guess. Sometimes with your string retainer, little tip when you're putting the strings through, this is how I do it. Obviously, because I've got my ball end here, I'll put a little kink in the end of the string, so I'll bend it a little bit so I can feed it underneath, then I'll pull through. And the string length I typically cut just as it gets to the end of the kind of string lock bolts here. So you've kind of got that string length there that winds around the post. So hopefully that helps, guys. It's just kind of a little bit of a off-the-cuff tips for using the Floyd. As I said, some people go on with them, some people don't. It's just like everything else. If you put in the time and effort and have a bit of patience, you'll get really used to it. And you're not going to string this up as quick as, say, a Les Paul. But the benefit is that it's pretty much, once it's tuned, it is tuned. And you can go do crazy stuff with it you're not going to be able to do in a Strat. Because the string ends here and here, that's how you can get that absolutely slack and then back to perfect tuning. Okay, so thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully there's some tips in there to help. Any questions, whatever, just put them below and I'll be happy to answer. So see you soon.